Yahav, the forgotten prosperity code. There is a word Jesus spoke before every important decision he ever made. It is not highlighted in the Gospels. It lives in the deeper layer of Aramaic, the language he actually thought and spoke in. Linguistic scholars who study ancient Semitic texts have identified a consistent pattern. Before every pivotal action, there was always a deliberate pause, a word that functioned as a mental anchor. It has 2 syllables. And once you understand what it means, you will recognize the hidden structure behind every major choice Jesus made. Stay until the middle of this video, because that is exactly when it gets revealed. Historical accounts of Jesus reveal a remarkably consistent behavioral pattern. He never acted on impulse when the decision carried real weight. Before choosing his disciples, he spent an entire night in prayer. Before answering the Pharisees, he went silente. Before walking toward Jerusalem knowing what awaited him there, he withdrew alone. This was not hesitation, it was discipline. Within the Semitic culture of his time, this kind of deliberate pause before action was not considered weakness. It was the mark of someone who understood that the quality of a decision is shaped long before the decision is visible. Ancient teachers transmitted this principle across generations, embedding it inside language itself. Certain Aramaic words were not just vocabulary. They were instruments designed to organize thought before movement occurred. The Aramaic language Jesus spoke operated differently from modern languages. Words carried layered meaning, they described action, but also encoded intention behind the action. Within this structure, specific expressions existed not simply to communicate, but to orient the speaker internally before engaging with the world externally. Scholars of ancient Aramaic identify one word that appears consistently linked to the concept of consciously entrusting direction, of releasing the outcome into a larger order before stepping forward. In its root, meaning YEHAV, relates to the act of giving over, surrendering the direction of a decision to something beyond personal calculation. It is not passive. It is an active internal movement, the deliberate choice to align intention before acting. Within the tradition Jesus operated in, this represented the transition point between reflection and movement. The moment when the mind stops weighing and begins committing. To speak Yahav was to mark that transition consciously. It meant, I've established my intention. I release the outcome. I move forward from clarity, not from fear. Why this changes how you read his decisions? Once you understand what YEHAV represents, the accounts of Jesus take on a different texture. The night before choosing 12 men who would carry his entire mission, that was YEHAV. Silence before responding to those trying to trap him. That was Yahav. The moment in Gethsemane, when everything in him resisted what was coming, and he said, "Not my will but yours." That is perhaps the most complete expression of YEHAV ever recorded. What these moments share is not passivity. They share a structure, internal order established before external action taken. This is precisely what ancient Semitic wisdom preserved the understanding, that decisions made from a settled center produce fundamentally different outcomes than decisions made from pressure, urgency, or fear. The tradition did not treat this as spiritual theory. It treated it as practical architecture for how a human being should approach anything that matters. Yahav did not begin with Jesus. It belongs to a much older current of Semitic wisdom, one that understood language as a tool for internal alignment, not just external communication. Ancient teachers passed this principle forward precisely because they observed its effects across generations. Decisions approached with this kind of deliberate inner ordering tended to hold. They produced consistency. They built things that lasted. Decisions made from reaction, urgency, or the pressure of circumstance tended to fracture over time. This is why the tradition preserved words like YEHAV, not as religious formulas, but as reminders of a sequence that works. Pause, align, release, move. The fact that Jesus operated consistently within this framework suggests he understood something that most people today have entirely lost access to. That stability is not something you find after acting. It is something you establish before. Everything covered in this video is the foundation, the complete guide. The most important Aramaic words, their exact pronunciation, and the full context of how they were used is pinned in the first comment. If this is resonating, that is where you go next. Yahav is not a formula. Ancient tradition never treated it as one. It is a practice, a conscious moment you insert before any decision that carries genuine weight. The sequence is simple, and it has not changed in 2,000 years. First, you stop. Not for hours. For a breath. Long enough to step back from the pressure of the moment. Second, you observe your intention. Not what you want the outcome to be, but why you are making this choice, and what you are actually trying to build. Third, you release the outcome. This is the core of YEHAV, the active surrender of the result to something larger than your own calculation. You commit to the direction. You let go of controlling what follows. Fourth, you move from that place, not from fear, not from urgency, not from what others expect you act. This is what Jesus did before every decision that history still remembers, not because he had no fear, but because he had a practice that allowed him to move through fear without being directed by it. YEHAV is that practice, and it is available to anyone willing to use it. If something shifted in you while watching this, if this felt like more than information, but the next step is already waiting. The complete guide is pinned in the first comment, and the next video goes deeper. The Aramaic tradition behind healing, restoration, and the words ancient teachers used to approach physical and emotional renewal. Do not miss Italiano.